Hello, grade 10 students. Mr. Flynn here checking in on Monday, and we're going to do a very short lesson today. I'm hoping this video is going to be as short as I can make it, okay? So I have uploaded a PowerPoint into the hub under content. So for the two P's, it's under the module that says from 1929 through 1945. For the two L's, it's just going to say the 1930s, or I believe it says the dirty 30s, okay? So just pause the video right now, go to the hub, go to the content section, go to that subsection, and open up the PowerPoint, and then come back to the video. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start on the first slide of the video, and you can just click through with me as I go through this slide as we go. So I'm going to try not to read every word on the slide because you can read that on your own, but I will point out kind of the important points. So the title slide says Canada in the 1930s, 10 lost years. And a reminder, so you remember the 1920s were called the Roaring 20s, and the reason it roared was because industry, or the factories that make all kinds of things, were extremely busy during this time. So the roar of the machines, if you kind of think about that. It was also the first decade of the automobile, particularly in the latter half of the 1920s. An automobile was all the rage, thanks in part to Henry Ford and cheaply made, mass-produced vehicles. He wasn't the only one to do this, but he's one of the innovators, certainly, in the assembly line process I've talked about in class. It also roared because it was a party decade. I mean, people came back from the war. Young people didn't want to hear about the war anymore. People were going out and partying. And even though Prohibition was on, people were still finding a way to dance and to party and, of course, to drink alcohol, which we've talked about before. It was also roaring economically. Although there was an economic recession in the early part of the 1920s, eventually things got better, and people were going out and buying all kinds of things that they wanted to start their families. That's another way that it was roaring, in that families were getting bigger and lots more people were being born. It's also a roaring decade because of the crazy stunts that people were engaging in. There were human fly competitions to climb buildings downtown. There were dance contests. I mean, it was a rip-roaring good time for a lot of Canadians, certainly. And then we moved into the 1930s, and this decade is called the Dirty 30s because of the Great Depression, right? So my last lesson, if you remember, we talked about the stock market crash and how everybody lost a whole bunch of money. That leads us into the Great Depression. Remember, a depression is not like feeling sad, but it's like a low point in the economy. So, there's a lot of unemployment, so people are out of jobs, and a lot of people are having trouble making money or even making ends meet. So a lot of people lost their homes, a lot of farmers lost their farms, and it's also called the Dirty 30s because of an event called the dust storms caused by a massive drought, especially in the prairie provinces. So Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and further south in the United States, in the Dakotas, and so on. Okay, so the first slide, we're going to move to the second slide, slide 2. And it says, here's some fun in the 1920s. And this is going to lead us into the 1930s. But we've already talked a lot about those kind of things. We talked about radio and dance contests, new appliances. We talked about entertainment. We talked about movies. At first, movies were silent, and usually a guy at the front would play a piano to kind of give music to what you were watching. And eventually, talkies became all the rage, or films with actual recorded audio, right? Kind of cool. So, making quick money in the 1920s, we've talked about that, investing and stock market. This is just a bit of a review of what we've already sort of done. And the fourth slide, so on slide number 4 now, it says at the top, but it couldn't last. And this refers to the stock market crash that we've already talked about, but again, a bit of review. So remember, the stock market crashed on October 29th, 1929. And the prices of stocks dropped. Refer to my earlier video, what stocks are. And many became worthless, the stocks became worthless, and people lost a lot of their savings. And many people were actually in debt after the stock crash because they had borrowed money to try and invest in the stock market. Companies found that they had too many products to sell to people who no longer had jobs or money. So pretend that you're a company that makes cars, right, like Henry Ford. And you've got your assembly line, and the assembly line is producing, I forget how many he was producing a day at that time. I think it's around 90 cars a day that they could produce in the early parts of the assembly plant. I have to look that up. I'm sorry if I don't have those numbers at the top of my brain. But let's just say 100 cars a day, for example. Okay. When I was at the Ford plant, we made 640 cars each shift, and we had 2 shifts. So 640 and 640, we made 1,280 cars every single day, right? So you can imagine if you're making all those cars and people stop buying the cars, well, what do? Do you shut down your factory? I think, yeah, eventually, but not at first, right? At first, you hope that people are going to start buying cars again, things are going to get better. So you keep making cars because you never want somebody to come and say, hey, I want a car, and you don't have one to sell them. So when the company's doing that, they're paying all their employees to make the cars. They're paying for the material, the metal, the rubber to get the cars, the electricity and the power and the bills and the property taxes as the company's still operating, making the cars that people aren't buying. Not great, because now the company has put a lot of money into cars that are just kind of sitting there. Okay. In the city, the next slide number 5. In the city, unemployment. Okay, so unemployment hits 25%. That means that 1 in every 4 people didn't have a job. So only these people were working. It may not sound that bad to you, but when you have 1 person that cannot get a job out of every 4 people, that means they're not out there and they're not spending money. And when they're not spending money, what happens to the economy? Remember the previous video, right? So people aren't buying stuff, so the economy starts to go down. The banks are calling in loans. They want their money back. So if you have a mortgage, for example, you own a home and you can't make your mortgage payments, like you can't make the payments to the bank because you borrowed the money to buy the home, guess what the bank does? Well, they take your loan, they take your home back and they try and sell it to get their money, right? Banks aren't in the business of losing money, that's for sure. Wages, of course, went down. In bad economic times, lots of people need work. And because lots of people need work, well, you can hire and fire if you have a company as much as you want because there's always somebody new who wants the next job, right? So pretty tough for people. And hundreds of people would line up just for a very few jobs. Okay, on to slide number 6. In the city, learning to survive, people made do with what they had. We had soup kitchens and bread lines. So we now call them food banks today, but at that time in the 1930s, they actually had places, a lot of times they were run by churches and charitable organizations, or sometimes just rich people would set these things up, where every day they'd have hot soup and bread for people who couldn't afford it. And you can sort of read the rest of that slide on your own, but take a look at the picture of the gentleman sleeping on the bench on the slide. It's pretty sad. And take a look at the lineup of people, and you can see it says free coffee and so on. Okay, the On to Ottawa Trek. The On to Ottawa Trek is basically a protest movement. Ottawa, as you know, is the capital of Canada, right? So it's our capital. So the On to Ottawa Trek is a bunch of young, mostly unemployed men and striking men who traveled to Ottawa in a big protest, hoping to hear their voices or have their voices heard by the government and get the government to make some changes if they could. They were also, of course, desperately looking for jobs. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on slide number 8. But it is important when we talk about the Prime Minister who largely gets connected to the Great Depression. His name is Richard Bedford Bennett, sometimes just called R.B. Bennett. And you can see a picture of him on the right-hand side there. He ordered that train onto Ottawa to stop. He was trying to control strikes and trying to control workers, and I'll let you read that slide on your own. And then we had a number of riots. People are upset, and hopefully you know what a riot is. It's when a whole bunch of people get together and they cause some unrest, for lack of a better word. Sometimes it can get quite violent, and in this case it actually did, the Regina riots. You can see those 8 people returned to Regina and continued the trek with other strikers. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they were stationed on the corners of the square or the big open space where the strikers meant to make plans. And when troops and police advanced on the strikers, a riot began and lasted all day long. So people went a little bit, they were very frustrated, right? So they wanted to make sure their message was heard, very frustrated. They went a little bit wild that day and it went on all day. Hundreds of people were injured and more than 130 arrested. And 1 person was actually killed, shot and killed by the RCMP. It was a pretty tense time. So this goes to show the frustration that people were feeling during the Great Depression. Okay, the next slide number 10, it has one of the most famous pictures from the Great Depression on the right-hand side of that woman, and you can see the worry on her face and her children, and you can see they're not looking like they're in great shape. They don't have a lot of money, and she looks as if she's worried about where the next meal is going to come from. You know, it's a very famous picture, one of the most famous pictures from the Great Depression. So in the prairie provinces, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all across the country, but especially there, they had a drought. So a drought is a lack of rain. And what happened is the rain wasn't making the soil wet. The soil dries up. The wind picks up that really dry soil, and it creates massive dust storms. So have you guys ever seen the movie The Mummy? Any of those mummy movies? Some of them are quite funny, although a little bit scary. So if you don't like scary films, don't watch them. But they're pretty good. But they use big sandstorms for big special effects in the film. I want you to think about that, like a wall of dirt coming at you with very windy conditions, and it was pretty tough for people to raise a crop or even live here. So a lot of people just left their farms. Years went by without rain, or without very much rain anyway, and this drought obviously would kill all of their crops. And if you don't have any crops, well, what are you going to feed your livestock, right? Like your cows and your pigs and your chickens and things like that. So very tough on everybody, and I think historians agree, especially tough on farmers during this time, especially in the prairie provinces. And then the next slide, slide number 11, in the country, dust. And you can see soil dried out to the point that a strong wind could cause the dust storm. Take a look at the picture on the right-hand side. It looks like a blizzard, like snow, but that's just dirt. So as an example, in my home, I don't know about your home, but in the cupboard, what we tend to do is take glasses and turn them upside down. That became something that everyone had to do in the prairie provinces because there was so much dust, it got into everything, including in the cupboards. So if you didn't turn your glasses upside down and you went to go get a glass of water, it would be full of dust, right? So you turn your glasses upside down and the dust couldn't get up into the glass. Kind of an idea there. And then you can read the quotation there on your own about grasshoppers, but I want to talk to you about grasshoppers. And they sometimes are called locusts, but a locust is like a big grasshopper. But they're these bugs, and they can jump and kind of fly for short distances, or for some can fly long distances, depends on the species. But and they became starved. So all the grass died, which is what they ate. When the grass died, the grasshoppers were flying around in massive swarms of millions of insects trying to get any kind of food. They ate everything. So you remember those corn, you ever seen those corn husk brooms? You know, the old brooms that you have with like the bristles? The grasshoppers would eat all the bristles off the broom. There are stories of them eating the leather off of tractors because they were starving. And these massive swarms of these insects would get into everything, including chicken coops, and the chickens would eat the grasshoppers, and the eggs would taste funny. Pretty rough time for everybody. Okay, the next slide, slide number 13. If you had money, here's the weird part. If you were rich, the Depression was actually really great. Because what happened, remember we talked about supply and demand in my earlier videos. So if nobody's going out and buying stuff, the demand for that stuff goes down. And what happens to the price? So if nobody wants something, what happens to the price of it? Like think about your parents, and just like me, your parents were probably raised with VCRs and DVD players, right? Everyone had to have a VCR. It was super cool. You could watch movies in your house for the first time. Well, then DVD players replaced these VCRs. And so what do you think happened to the demand for VCRs? Well, nobody wanted them. So what happened to the price for VCRs? Well, the price went down. If you can find a VCR anywhere right now, they're probably less than $20. When my family bought its first VCR, I think it was $400. They were very expensive back in the day. So what I mean to say is, if you had money, you lived very well during the Great Depression because prices are going down. You could buy property more cheaply. You could buy cars more cheaply. Entertainment was cheaper. If you had money, you were actually living better, unfortunately. So another example of the rich getting kind of richer and the poor getting more poor. Okay, so moving on to slide 15, our second last slide of the deck. It just talks about escapism. So it's the idea that people wanted to try and forget their troubles during the Great Depression and go and think about something else. So movies had quite a heyday in the 1930s. People enjoyed going to the films and so on and so forth. Big bands and concerts were very popular as well, especially outdoor bands and concerts. To this day, you've probably been to a free outdoor concert, maybe over in Bayfront Park or maybe in Gage Park. Those free concerts, this tradition really started to take off in the 1930s to try and people became very popular in the 1930s because people are looking for some kind of entertainment to escape the realities. Now, some solutions, which are in slide 15 of 17, our second last slide. just really quickly, if you remember in class, I talked about tariffs. So a tariff is just a tax on something that somebody's trying to ship into Canada to sell it. So if the United States, for example, is making t-shirts, well, we make t-shirts here in Canada too. So we'll put a tariff or a tax on American t-shirts so they cost more money. So if a Canadian goes to a store and they see a Canadian-made t-shirt or an American-made t-shirt and that one's more expensive, which one are they going to buy? Assuming they're the same t-shirt more or less, like this is a Levi's t-shirt, then they're going to buy the Canadian-made t-shirt because it's cheaper. So they were trying to protect their economies with tariffs. Other people thought that the economy could be left alone. It's just going to fix itself. Don't worry about it. Have you heard that before any time in the last few days, that it's just going to fix itself? Think of what's happening right now. Anyway, and then some people wanted government intervention. They thought if the government went out and spent a lot of money to build things or create projects, that would give people jobs. People have jobs, they have money. If they have money, they go out and spend, and therefore things start getting better. So a lot of the roads that we have in Ontario, as an example, if you've ever been up to Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie, those roads that are blasted through the rock, you know the ones I'm talking about? Like you'll be driving on the highway and all of a sudden you see these walls of rock on either side of you. Many of those were blasted out during the Great Depression in work camps as a way to give young men work. Okay, so there's an example. And then one party said that everyone should get $25 a month to get the economy going again. Okay, everyone just gets free $25. And if you've been following the news at all, then you've probably heard the same solution that's been suggested now during this coronavirus thing. So one moment, I know history teachers always do this all the time. One of the reasons we learn history is because it tends to repeat itself, right? So right now, the word that they're talking about or the phrase they're talking about is universal basic income. The idea that if everyone got a certain amount of money every month, even if they weren't working, then they'd be able to go out and spend and the economy would do well. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Interesting and something for you to think about. Okay, and then in the end, by the late 1930s, the Depression began to ease as tensions in the world grew. And there was an event in 1939, and if you're reading the slide, you can probably already read it, but what do you think happened in 1939 that gave everyone jobs almost overnight, didn't have other great effects, but it ended the Great Depression, a lot of historians say? That's right, World War II began. What kinds of jobs were people getting? Well, the number one job is all these armies that needed soldiers had to pay them. So everyone who joined the army got 3 square meals a day, you got a roof over your head, and you got a small amount of pay. So that's the number one way to cure unemployment. All these people who weren't working, they rushed and joined the army. And the Great Depression was around the world. So countries like Germany, countries like England, countries like France had a lot of young men run and go sign up. It was better than not working. And then, of course, if you didn't sign up for the military, then you stayed home and you worked in factories making stuff for the war. Okay. So the last slide is a very short writing task that I have for you. So basically, all I want you to do is pretend you're in the 1930s, and I want you to write a diary entry. So just pretend you have a diary. Even if you don't have a diary, pretend you have a diary. And I want you to write a diary entry as if you're writing it for your grandkids. And you want to try and explain to them what life is like during the dirty 30s, during the 1930s. Okay? So I want you to include some of the details in this slide deck that I've gone over today. You can talk about unemployment. You can talk about the drought. You can talk about how people are going to movies and trying to escape. You can talk about the protests. You can talk about what you read in the newspaper for the Regina riots. And I want you to try and convince your grandchild, who hasn't read this yet, they're going to read it years down the road, of the realities of life in the Great Depression. So if you're in the 2P class, okay, so the grade 10 CHC 2Ps, then I want it to be about 3 paragraphs long. If you're in my 2L class, I just want 1 paragraph. A couple reminders about paragraphing. You want a capital letter at the beginning of every sentence. Every paragraph should have between 6 to 8 sentences in it. Okay, so for my 2Ls, you're aiming for between 6 to 8 sentences if you can. And you want to do it on a Google Doc or a Word document and drop it in the Dropbox. I've created a Dropbox for both classes. And again, show me that you know as many details about the Great Depression as possible. Okay, thank you all for listening. One last thing. On Wednesday this week, I'm going to be having a virtual meeting again with a virtual classroom tool in the hub. You should see the invitation as it's going to pop into your things. If you can, please try and attend the meeting. I want to see as many faces of my friends as possible. Okay, all the best to you and your families. I hope you're doing well, and stay safe and stay healthy. Okay, all the best.